Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to dissect some classic sociology.
Always up for a good sociological autopsy.
Today we're tackling social stratification. We've got excerpts from Kingsley Davis and Wilbert E. Moore's Some Principles of Stratification.
A real foundational text.
Melvin Tumin's critique of that work.
Throwing down the gauntlet.
And then Davis's reply.
A heated debate indeed.
So it's a three-way sociological showdown for grad school glory.
Exactly. And Davis and Moore set the stage in 1945. They're coming from a functionalist perspective.
Functionalists, so looking at how things work to keep society stable.
Precisely. Their main argument is that stratification, the unequal distribution of rewards and prestige, it's universal.
Like every society has it.
Every society. And not only that, they say it's necessary for societies to function. It's not about whether it's good or bad morally.
More like it just is.
Right, like societal gravity. It's just there. They argue that societies need a way to ensure that the most important positions are filled by the most qualified people.
So brain surgeons make more than, say, a cashier, because their job is more important for keeping people alive.
That's the idea. They call it the requirement faced by any society of placing and motivating individuals in the social structure. And to do this, societies develop systems of rewards.
Money, prestige, power, the good stuff.
Exactly. Those rewards incentivize people to strive for those crucial roles.
But how do they determine what makes one position more important than another? Seems pretty subjective.
That's where their two key concepts come in. Differential functional importance and differential scarcity of personnel.
Okay, break that down for me.
So differential functional importance means some positions are just more critical for a society's survival.
Like air traffic controllers, if they mess up, bad things happen.
Exactly. And differential scarcity of personnel means that some positions require rare skills or talents.
Like not everyone can be a rocket scientist.
Precisely. And they argue that the combination of these two factors, importance and scarcity, determines a position's rank in the stratification system. So the more important and the harder it is to find someone to do it.
The higher up the ladder they are, and the more rewards they get.
Exactly. It's all about matching talent to task, so to speak.
So are they saying that societies are basically stuck with this system? What about social mobility, the idea that people can move up or down the ladder?
They do acknowledge that societies vary in their degree of stratification, but they argue that some level of inequality is inevitable. They point to factors like specialization.
How divided up the jobs are.
Right, and the type of functional emphasis a society has. For example, a society focused on military power might place a higher value on soldiers than on artists.
Makes sense. Different societies have different priorities.
Exactly. And they also talk about the magnitude of differences in rewards between positions as a factor.
So how big is the gap between the top and the bottom?
Right. And then opportunity, how easy or difficult is it to move between different strata?
And stratum solidarity, that sounds intense.
It refers to the sense of unity or shared interests within a particular social group.
So like, do the elites stick together or do they compete with each other?
Precisely. So Davis and Moore have laid out this grand theory of stratification. It's a way of explaining why inequality exists in all societies.
It's a pretty bold claim. But then along comes Melvin Tumin in 1953, and he's not buying it.
Oh, he's ready to rumble. Tumin launches a scathing critique of their theory. He argues that Davis and Moore, while presenting their theory as an objective explanation...
Just trying to understand how things work?
Right. He argues that their theory actually serves to justify the existing system of inequality.
Like they're saying inequality is natural and necessary, so don't even try to change it.
Exactly. He calls them out for focusing on the maintenance of a given system of stratification instead of exploring its origins or considering alternatives.
So it's like they're describing the machine, but not questioning whether it's the right machine or if there might be a better one.
That's a great analogy. And Tumin systematically picks apart their arguments, piece by piece. For example, he challenges the whole concept of functional importance.
The idea that some jobs are just more important than others.
Right. He argues that it's often based on subjective, value-laden judgments, not any objective measure. Like, who decides what's important?
Yeah, like is a hedge fund manager really more important to society than a teacher? Depends on what you value, right?
Exactly. Tumin uses the example of unskilled workers and engineers in a factory.
He says that the engineers might design the machines, But the workers are the ones who actually make the factory run.
Right. So who's really more functionally important? It's not as clear-cut as Davis and Moore make it seem.
So Tumin is poking holes in their logic. What else does he take issue with?
He also goes after their claim that stratification helps societies discover and develop talent.
The idea that the rewards at the top motivate people to work hard and achieve great things.
Right. Tumin argues quite the opposite, that stratification actually hinders talent discovery by limiting opportunities for people from less privileged backgrounds.
It's like saying, if you only look for talent in the wealthy neighborhoods, you're going to miss out on all the brilliant minds stuck in poverty.
Precisely. He argues that it's a systemic bias, not a true reflection of talent distribution.
So he's saying that Davis and Moore's theory ignores the very real barriers that prevent people from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He then tackles their sacrifice concept.
The idea that people who undergo long periods of training for those high-status positions are making sacrifices and deserve higher rewards.
Precisely. Tumin points out that, in many cases, families bear the costs of this training, not the individuals themselves.
Like, if your parents are paying for your medical school, are you really making a sacrifice?
He uses that exact example, parents paying for their children's education. He writes, "Is it a sacrifice for a rich man's son to go to medical school when his father pays all the bills?"
Ouch. He's calling out the privilege that's often hidden behind those claims of sacrifice.
Right. And he argues that this focus on individual sacrifice ignores the structural factors that create and maintain inequality.
So Tumin is challenging Davis and Moore on multiple fronts. Is there anything else he disagrees with?
Oh, he's just getting started. He also challenges their assumption that differential rewards are the only way to motivate people.
So he's saying that maybe people aren't just motivated by money and status. There are other things that drive us.
Exactly. He proposes alternative motivational schemes like joy in work, finding satisfaction in doing a job well.
Some people genuinely love what they do, regardless of the paycheck.
Right. And he also talks about social duty, a sense of responsibility to contribute to the common good.
Like firefighters running into burning buildings. They're not doing it for the money.
Precisely. Tumin argues that these motivations are real and powerful, and that a society that relies solely on differential rewards might be missing out on a lot of untapped potential.
So it's a more optimistic view of human nature, I guess.
It is. He also questions the inevitability of differential prestige and esteem being tied to unequal power and property.
The idea that those at the top are naturally seen as more worthy of respect and admiration.
Right. Tumin argues that this is a socially constructed outcome, not some natural law. He writes, if the rights and perquisites of different positions in a society must be unequal, then the sentiments of those who fill these positions will become different.
So it's the inequality that breeds the difference in attitudes, not the other way around.
Exactly. He's challenging the idea that those at the top are somehow inherently better or more deserving.
Well, Tumin is really going after the foundation of Davis and Moore's theory. But doesn't Davis fire back at these criticisms?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He publishes a reply in the same year, 1953, and he doesn't hold back.
This is getting good. Let's dig into that reply next time.
Stay tuned for round 2 of this sociological slugfest.
Back for round 2 of Davis versus Tumin. Last we left off, Tumin was throwing some serious punches, critiquing Davis and Moore's theory of social stratification.
Yeah, he really went after their concepts of functional importance, sacrifice, and even the idea that differential rewards are the only way to motivate people.
He proposed joy in work and social duty as alternative motivators.
Right, suggesting that maybe we don't need all these fancy rewards and punishments to keep society running.
But I'm sure Davis had something to say about that.
Oh, he definitely did. In his 1953 reply, Davis starts by clarifying the purpose of their theory.
Setting the record straight.
Exactly. He argues that their aim was to explain the existence of inequality, not to justify it.
So he's saying, hey, we're just trying to understand how this thing works, not endorse it.
Right. It's like a sociologist studying crime. They're not condoning criminal activity, just trying to figure out why it happened.
Okay, so he's pushing back against Tumin's accusation that they're just trying to rationalize the status quo.
Exactly. He then addresses Tumin's critique of the functional importance concept.
The idea that some jobs are just more crucial for society's survival than others.
Right. Davis argues that societies, in practice, do make judgments about the relative importance of different positions, even if those judgments aren't always perfect or objective.
Like in wartime, suddenly making tanks becomes way more important than making, say, plush toys.
He uses that very example wartime resource allocation to illustrate his point. He argues that in times of crisis, societies have to make tough choices about which industries and occupations are most crucial, and those choices reflect implicit judgments about functional importance.
It's a matter of life or death.
Literally. So he's saying that the functional importance concept isn't just some abstract idea, it plays out in real-world decision-making.
Especially when the stakes are high. Okay, what about Tumin's critique of the scarcity of qualified personnel idea?
Davis defends that too. He argues that even if a society doesn't have perfect knowledge of all the talent in its population, systems of selection and training still operate to identify and develop individuals for important roles.
So even if we don't know exactly who all the brilliant doctors or engineers are out there, the system is designed to find them.
Right. He uses an interesting analogy to make his point.
Hit me with it.
He compares it to organized baseball. Scouts don't need to know every single talented baseball player in the country. The system of tryouts, minor leagues, and so on serves to identify and elevate talented players over time.
Even if some slip through the cracks.
Exactly. It's not a perfect system, but it's designed to sift through the masses and find the most promising individuals.
Okay, that's a pretty clever analogy. Now, what about Tumin's argument that stratification actually strangles talent?
Davis clarifies that their theory was focused on explaining the differential prestige of positions, not individuals.
So just because someone might inherit a high-status position doesn't mean the prestige system isn't still working to attract talented individuals to similar positions.
Right. He acknowledges that inheritance can limit vertical mobility.
Like if your parents are doctors, you're more likely to become a doctor yourself.
But he argues that it doesn't completely negate the selective role of the prestige system.
So even if the playing field isn't perfectly level, the lure of those high-status positions still motivates people to develop their skills.
He's saying that the system still works to sort people into roles based on their abilities, at least to some extent.
Okay, so Davis has addressed the functional importance and scarcity of personnel critiques. What about those alternative motivational schemes that Tumin proposed? The joy in work and sense of social duty stuff.
Davis doesn't dismiss those motivations entirely. He acknowledges that they're real and valuable.
So he's not saying that people don't find satisfaction in their work or feel a sense of obligation to contribute to society?
Right, but he argues that those motivations alone are unlikely to be enough to ensure that all essential societal positions are filled.
So you can't just rely on everyone finding their work intrinsically fulfilling.
Especially those jobs that are, let's face it, not inherently enjoyable.
Like garbage collection or cleaning toilets.
Exactly. He literally says a sense of social service is not a dependable motive. Not every job is going to inspire you to leap out of bed every morning.
So he's arguing that we need those material incentives, those differential rewards, to keep society functioning.
That's a key tenet of the functionalist perspective. They believe societies need to channel individual self-interest to serve collective needs.
It's a bit of a pragmatic view of human nature, maybe even a little cynical.
Perhaps. But it's also a recognition that societies are complex systems, and sometimes you need a little carrot and stick to keep things running smoothly.
So a little inequality is the price we pay for a functioning society.
That's the argument, at least from the functionalist perspective. And this ties into Davis's discussion of the distinction between esteem and prestige, which he felt Tumin had conflated.
Remind me again, what's the difference?
Esteem is the approval you earn for fulfilling the duties of a position, while prestige is the approval attached to the position itself, regardless of individual performance.
So you could be a brilliant but humble teacher with high esteem but low prestige, while a mediocre CEO might have high prestige but low esteem.
Exactly. And Davis argues that this distinction is crucial for understanding how stratification works. A system based purely on esteem wouldn't provide enough incentive for people to strive for those higher status positions.
So it's the allure of prestige, that social recognition that comes with certain roles, that drives ambition and innovation.
That's the argument. And he believes that this distinction helps explain why people might pursue positions of power or status, even if those positions aren't necessarily fulfilling or socially beneficial.
They're chasing the prestige, even if it comes at a personal cost.
Right. So Davis has systematically addressed Tumin's critiques, defending the functionalist perspective on social stratification. It's a robust rebuttal, to say the least.
It's been a fascinating back and forth, that's for sure. And now let's dive into the nitty-gritty details. What kind of evidence and data do they use to support their arguments?
That's where things get even more interesting.
All right, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What kind of data are we working with here?
Well, Davis and Moore, in their original article, they don't rely heavily on empirical data. They're presenting their theory more as a logical framework.
Okay, so it's more about building a conceptual model than crunching numbers.
Exactly. They argue that stratification is so widespread across so many different cultures and historical periods.
Like it's basically universal.
Right, that it must serve some essential function. They even say if the duties associated with the various positions were all equally pleasant to perform, all equally important to societal survival, and all equally in need of the same ability and talent, it would make no difference who got into which positions, and the problem of social placement would be greatly simplified.
So they're saying if it wasn't necessary, wouldn't we have found a different way by now?
That's the gist of it, and they connect their theory to other sociological ideas.
Like what?
Role differentiation, social integration. They're arguing that stratification emerges as a way to make sure these essential functions get done.
So it's not just about individual ambition, it's about the needs of the whole society.
Exactly. Now, Tumin, in his critique, he doesn't really try to directly refute their empirical claims, because there aren't many.
He's more focused on their logic and assumptions.
Right, challenging the foundation of their argument. Like, he critiques their reliance on functional importance as this key variable.
The idea that some jobs are just more important than others.
Right, he says it's hard to measure objectively, and often it's circular reasoning.
He writes, the functional importance of a position is determined by the extent to which other positions are dependent upon it.
Which is like saying a job is important because other jobs depend on it. Doesn't really tell us why it's important, just that it is.
And he points out that what's considered functionally important can change over time, across cultures.
Exactly. What's essential in one society might be totally obsolete in another.
It's like being a blacksmith used to be a high-status job, now it's more of a hobby.
Exactly. And Tumin argues that just focusing on functional importance ignores other factors that shape stratification.
Like what?
Power, conflict. He suggests that people in power often manipulate the system to benefit themselves.
Whether or not their role is actually that important.
Right, like those CEOs who get huge bonuses even when their companies are failing.
They might be in a functionally important position, but their performance doesn't match the rewards.
He's bringing in the element of power dynamics, which Davis and Moore don't really address.
Okay, so what about Davis's reply? Does he try to bring in more data to support his side?
He defends their approach, says their goal was to develop a general theory, not to do a specific empirical study. He writes, our concern was with a general functional problem found in any society.
So they were building a framework, not testing it out in the specific case.
Right. He does use some examples, like that wartime resource allocation.
Where making tanks suddenly becomes a top priority.
Exactly. But his main focus is clarifying their theory and responding to Tumin's critiques.
So it's a debate that's more about ideas and logic than hard data.
Yeah, which makes sense given how complex the issue is. And it's worth noting, both sides acknowledge the limitations of their approach.
Nobody's claiming to have all the answers.
Right. Davis and Moore admit their theory doesn't explain everything about stratification, and Tumin says his critique is more about raising questions.
It's a nuanced conversation, which is what sociology is all about.
Exactly. It's a field that embraces complexity, and this debate is a great example of that.
It really pushes us to think critically about how societies work, the role of inequality, the nature of human motivation. It's the kind of stuff that keeps sociologists up at night.
For sure. And even though these articles were published decades ago, they're still incredibly relevant today.
We're still wrestling with these same issues: inequality, social mobility, the balance between rewarding talent and ensuring fairness.
It's an ongoing conversation, and this debate gives us a framework for thinking about these challenges, for asking the right questions.
It's not just an academic exercise. It's about understanding the world around us and hopefully making it a little bit better.
So keep those sociological imaginations firing. There's still a lot to explore, a lot to discuss, a lot to change.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another sociological adventure.